So, excuse me, thank you, Don. If I occasionally cough, it's I'm, excuse me, on the tail end of um, something. So, thank you for being allowing me to be able to share with you what I've been working on. Um, just a couple of things to give some context. I'm the co-founder of an organization in Haiti called the Smallholder Farmers Alliance, and there we work with around 7,000 smallholder farmers. That's when husband and wife farm together. We identify them as separate but equal members of the organization, which was in itself a bit of a novelty when we did that initially in Haiti. And the focus is on tree planting and improving agriculture. I'm also the co-founder of a more recent organization called Futura, a nonprofit focused on regenerative agriculture. And my role there involves leading the development of several smallholder regenerative projects, um, currently one in Brazil, Kenya, Indonesia, and shortly we'll be starting one in India. I'm also leading a program within the Futura organization to involve artificial intelligence to expand the volume and accessibility of field research into regenerative, smallholder regenerative farming. And for that, we have pilots that are in development in both Africa and Latin America. Um, as some of you may know, the late Richard St. Barr Baker was my mentor for the last years of his life. And that's been a very, very major influence on all aspects of my work. So I want to start with an explanation regarding regenerative agriculture. Don, you had sent me a message a little while ago indicating that somebody had asked about the different methods of farming and wanting to know the difference between, particularly, for example, organic and regenerative. And so I just wanted to touch on that for a minute. As industrial scale agriculture took shape over the last century, there were a number of experiments and basically look at the way in which it manifests was in counterpoint to industrial agriculture. Um, Systems like organic or permaculture or biodynamic or biointensive or agroecology. There's a whole group of these different forms of sustainable agriculture. And many people have looked at these as being competitive in some way. And without wanting to be disrespectful of the concept, I think of them as essentially being a kind of progressive revelation in the Baha'i context. They are all part of the same larger process of looking at the need to move towards sustainable agriculture, no matter what you call it. And so, to me, what's very interesting now is that regenerative agriculture is drawing on every one of those traditions. And elements you can see from literally from every one of them has been incorporated into regenerative. But also, regenerative is reaching much deeper into indigenous and ancestral knowledge and combining all of that with contemporary science and using science as a tool and not as a kind of overarching driving force. So, at its core, regenerative agriculture goes beyond just sustainability per se to actively improve and to measure the improvement in the process of growing food. So it goes beyond do no harm into a more proactive improvement. Um, and that manifests in terms of environmental, biological, social, and financial aspects of farming. So it's very holistic in its approach. Now, people might say, well, permaculture does that. Yes, but none of these other systems have ever been able to move into a larger scaling potential. For example, organic, certified organic at least, is not even just a little over, I guess, 2% of arable land globally after 60 years of effort. So we need something that's going to go well beyond that if we're going to have a real impact. And so this is where regenerative comes in. And one of the other big differences is a very significant focus on measurable outcome. If you take just looking at organic is a set of practices, excuse me, that are the same no matter where you're looking at organic agriculture in the world. But it's essentially prescriptive in terms of asking people to follow certain practices, whereas regenerative, which does include those practices and more, is not based on um, monitoring practice. It's based on measuring outcome and then using those measurements as a feedback mechanism to be able to continually improve um, regenerative agriculture, no matter what the scale is. Another important dimension of regenerative is that, in difference primarily to organic, which is this single set of practices applied universally, um, regenerative does have a set of practices that are recommended, but always it has to be adapted to local conditions, local cultural conditions, environmental, um, farming traditions, etc. And so it's always going to be different depending on where you are. That can be complicated, Sometimes it makes it very difficult to have standardized forms of those measurement of outcomes that I mentioned. But to just put it in its current perspective, um, and this is me going out on a limb. I try to be as informed as I can across many different um, regions around the world regarding regenerative. But my estimate is that currently there are 8 million, roughly 8 million farms collectively around the world that identify as being fully regenerative. And again, this is my estimate that 75% of those, or roughly 6 million, are smallholder farmers. Now, those of you familiar with the whole category will say, well, that doesn't jive with the number of acres that are claimed to be regenerative. And that's because um, the bulk of the big claims with regard to regenerative acreage are dealing with large-scale monoculture plots like, McCain's potatoes on a giant monoculture plot. And to me, this may be veering off topic a bit, but um, because they are choosing to identify soil health as the single indicator of compliance with regenerative principles, and at the same time using GMOs and chemical inputs, to me negates the validity of that. That's possibly another topic. I do write a lot about this, but so that's just to explain the discrepancy between the total volume of acreage that's regenerative versus the number of farms, because the bulk of them are smallholders. And in terms of smallholders, um, I grew up at a small farm in the prairies in Canada. Archie and I went to school together. Um, Now, those were small, not smallholder farms, I hasten to add. But I never met a smallholder farmer till I started working in Haiti in 2005. And the definition of a smallholder is 2 hectares or 5 acres or less. And what's fascinating is that as I began to work with smallholders in Haiti, I then started to look into the situation of smallholders on a global scale. And even though smallholders have been kind of, marginalized since the onset of industrial agriculture, in its current form, it really emerged in the late 50s and early 1960s. And there was a default assumption that smallholder farmers would, go away because industrial agriculture had become the norm. But in spite of that, there are still, to this day, 475 million smallholder farms throughout the global south, the developing countries of the global south. So you add up the people who live and work on those farms, well, that's 2 billion people. Um, Farming 24% of arable land in the world and producing, despite the challenges that the smallholders face, they're producing 30% of the world's food. And so those 2 billion people living and working on those farms represents, um, a quarter of humanity. Um, Now, what I'm proposing, and this is the subject of my new book, Whole Earth Farming, which will, if all goes well, be coming out in September of this year. My premise is that if half the world's smallholder farmers, so that would be about 240 million, were to switch to regenerative agriculture, and that would be on 12% of the world's arable land, that would allow them to increase production sufficient to feed the 1.5 billion people who are going to be added to the world's population by 2050, all of whom, 100% of the additional 1.5 billion people by 2050 will be in the global south. So why not support the smallholders in the same region to grow the additional food that's necessary to feed that increased population and do so in a way that not only does not contribute to global warming, but helps to reduce global warming in the process of growing the food. So that's my big pitch. So um, in terms of where regenerative agriculture started, Robert Rodale, was the son of J.I. Rodale from the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, which is one of the great sustainable agriculture institutions in the world. But it was Robert Rodale who coined the term regenerative agriculture in the 1980s. And he used it to describe farming systems that go beyond sustainability to actively improve and restore degraded land. It didn't catch on. And the term regenerative agriculture was dormant after Robert Rodale's death in 1990. But then there's been a resurgence in the last 10 years or so. And so suddenly we have this increasingly widely accepted term, regenerative agriculture. But for Baha'is, what is interesting is that it has a much longer history. And essentially, Abdu'l-Baha is the true pioneer of regenerative agriculture. We all know the story about Abdu'l-Baha providing grain to the population in Haifa during World War I that prevented starvation. But the whole story of what was behind that, um, really we owe to Paul Hanley for Paul's book, 2024 book on Adesea, the story of Abdu'l-Baha's model farming community. And Paul, in turn, drew on research that had been done by Iraj Pushti, a Persian Baha'i living in England for much of the latter part of his life. And he'd been working on a book when he passed in 2008, interviewing former residents of Adesea who were elderly and recording their memories. and Iraj was an agronomist. And in fact, when I was a student in England in the late 70s, early 80s, I set up a small um, company to import organic fertilizers and bioproducts into England. And I worked with Iraj in that company, so I knew him from a very early period of my life. He was an amazing guy. So the story of Adesanya, which is now in Jordan, started in 1901 when Abdu'l-Baha began this farming community, establishing this farming community in an area that was incredibly desolate in Jordan. And essentially, he was working with small-scale family farmers. We now would refer to them as smallholders. That was not a common term at the time. And Abdu'l-Baha did not call what he did regenerative. But when you go through Paul's incredibly important book, and I can't emphasize how much I admire you for having set that in motion, Paul. Um, if you read the history of Adesanya and look at the details that Paul's book contains, and you look at things like, the fact that there were 50 species of crops and vegetables and trees and livestock in what Abdu'l-Baha designed, the focus on soil regeneration and using organic matter to improve soil, the water management techniques, crop rotations, livestock integration, um, tree integration in like agroforestry systems, um, site contouring, every aspect of what Abdu'l-Baha created is essentially a blueprint for regenerative agriculture. So what keeps me up at night at the moment, as I work to finish my book, um, is trying to figure out how we can make a contribution to the emerging category of regenerative agriculture, particularly as it relates to smallholder farmers, by drawing on the Baha'i spiritual principles for agriculture. As we're all well aware, the Baha'i Faith is unique in the world's religions in the importance that our founders placed on agriculture and the role of farmers and villages in the global order of things. And this is where we owe a great debt to Winnie Merritt for compiling Food, Farmer, and Community, Agriculture and the Reconstruction of the World. And if it wasn't for these two books from Paul and Winnie, I would not be here talking to you today. So we really owe you both a great debt. Thank you. So although it doesn't exist anywhere as a set um, of specific principles on agriculture, for agriculture, I'm working on, excuse me, identifying a set of Baha'i spiritual principles for agriculture that can be shared with the larger community involved in regenerative agriculture, with the audacious suggestion that this could help in the scaling of regenerative agriculture. Why not, you know? Um, and I have a bit of a platform, so at least some of them anyway have no choice but to listen to me, at least for the first part of my pitch. So it starts off, and I'm just going to give 6 principles. I'm working on identifying more, but just to sort of give the flavor of this. So the first is the primacy of the farmer. And here, um, when Abdu'l-Baha writes, the question of economics must commence with the farmer and then be extended to the other classes, inasmuch as the number of farmers is far greater than all other classes. Therefore, it is fitting to begin with the farmer in matters related to economics, for the farmer is the first active agent in human society. So the way I'm sharing this with non-Baha'is is to say, here is a way to look differently at the whole category of farmers. They're not just one economic sector among many, but they're the foundational element upon which, human society depends. And so then if you just look at the numbers, so a quarter of humanity is engaged in smallholder farming, living and working on smallholder farms, then they suddenly can be identified as the largest underperforming sector of the global economy. And then looking at how do you recraft policies and subsidies and international trade agreements and international development assistance to respond to this notion of the primacy of the farmer. So it has very practical implications beyond simply the spiritual. Another one is looking at agriculture as a worship. We're all familiar with the idea of work as worship within the Baha'i context. But if you apply that to agriculture, then it helps to elevate the way in which smallholder farmers in particular see themselves. They're contributing to a larger process. It changes the understanding of agriculture work from just labor to a spiritual practice. Then we get into things like justice in economic relations. And here, this is where Abdu'l-Baha talks about when you have, and I'm not going to read the quote, but when you've got problems between owners and workers, um, they need to be dealt with collectively because it's not just a private matter, it's detrimental to the common good. And so when you realize agricultural economics can't be separated from these questions of justice and fairness, then it starts to translate to needing to look at those issues as part of any development initiative. You have to incorporate that into the core structure. And that's another aspect of regenerative agriculture. Now, some people may be familiar with agroecology. And if you were to go into two fields side by side in a developing country, one was agroecology and one was regenerative, you would not be able to tell the difference. However, there are other dimensions to both that differentiate them. One is that agroecology is very deeply committed to this idea of justice and fairness, but for them, for the people who follow that methodology, it is politicized. And so regenerative addresses the same issue, but in a more systemic way that is not politicized. Another reason why I gravitate towards regenerative, because I can see it has a much bigger potential for application without getting into that particularly muddy set of waters. Again, I know that I'm just touching very briefly on many of these things. Um, and you'll be happy to know that should you choose to buy my book when it comes out, that I spend a lot of time looking at all of these issues and particularly trying to dissect how the Baha'i spiritual principles for agriculture impact the practical application of things like justice and fairness at a community level for smallholder regenerative farmers. Then we go to the equality of men and women. Obviously, it's a spiritual principle that transcends every aspect of life. But when you begin to apply it as an agricultural principle, and this is where, again, it's particularly relevant for smallholders. Um, Having worked with smallholders in Haiti and being familiar with smallholder programs in many parts of the world, it is by no means a given that men and women are equal. And this comes into play particularly when husband and wife farm together, which is very much a norm for smallholder farmers. Women are systematically cut out of access to credit, to training, to decision making. And, I've spent 15 years in Haiti systematically working to change that. And what's been interesting is that when we first launched and announced that men and women were going to have separate but equal membership in our organization, a lot of people were horrified because nobody had ever done that. But it was so interesting. Nobody blinked in terms of the farmers. I'm not sure whether it made sense or they just wanted to see what would happen, but it worked beautifully. And then a delegation of women farmers shortly afterwards approached my co-founder. His name is Timothée Georges, not a Baha'i, but a Christian. Anyway, they approached us and said, could they get access to low interest loans to help improve their farms and set up small side businesses to supplement their incomes. So we created a microcredit bank only for women farmers. And again, we didn't know whether this would be received well within the rural communities, but again, nobody blinked. They knew intuitively that women were going to be much more responsible in those communities to actually, treat it with respect. And to this day, we started that in 2011. We give out something like 900 loans a year. They range between, $50 US and 1,500. And we've had not a single default on a loan in all that time. So when you apply something like a spiritual principle about the equality of women and men within the context of smallholder farmers, it makes absolute sense. Then looking at the fifth one I wanted to raise is the idea of consultation and collective decision making. And again, Abdu'l-Baha lays this out in terms of the question of consultation being of the utmost importance and goes into details which I'm sure you're familiar with. But this becomes absolutely essential when you're dealing with smallholder farmers. Because if a project comes in and basically enlists smallholder farmers and you, as an outsider, you say, listen, I've got a great idea. I've got the money to pay for it. And this is what I think you should do. And here's the blueprint. And basically, you're setting yourself up for failure because the moment you walk away and the funding stops, the whole thing basically collapses. I saw this, firsthand in Haiti. USAID, which no longer exists, um, had many faults. But there were many good people who were part of that and who did amazing things. However, it was very much a prescriptive, externally imposed process. And so I often speak about the legacy of not all, but much of USAID's presence in Haiti. It's essentially a graveyard of dead USAID projects. Um, I shouldn't go into any more detail, but let's just say this particular aspect of consultation is consultation and collective decision making, which then translates to ownership over the whole process at a community level. The sixth one I'm looking at is service to the common good. This is the Baha'i International Community saying the farmer must be accorded his or her rightful place in the processes of development and civilization building. As the villages are reconstructed, the cities will follow. So if you readjust your lens, this is speaking to the non-Baha'i community, readjust your lens to look at the ultimate purpose of all human activity, including agriculture, to be focused on the advancement of civilization and the betterment of humanity. And then you say, okay, these smallholder farmers are contributing to that process. They are directly contributing to creating sustainability in the process of growing food. That then opens up the potential for compensating those farmers through things like carbon credits or natural asset purchasing. And carbon credits is not yet a well-developed field, and it has had some spectacular failures internationally. Um, asset, Natural assets becoming a category for investment is its own minefield. I have a big article coming out in January that talks about the potential for new money in sustainable agriculture. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, but we have to be aware of some of the pitfalls, and people have to become more directly engaged and informed to prevent it becoming just another example of how smallholders get exploited. But the potential and the principle that in the course of providing a service to the common good, to the global commons that smallholders represent, they should be adequately compensated for that. This is not charity. This is acknowledging a contribution that should have an economic value associated with it. The last one I'm just going to mention is the essential oneness of humanity, which we all know as a core principle, the core principle of the Baha'i Faith. But when you start to apply that to regenerative agriculture and the idea of the complete and inseparable integration of all aspects of creation, spiritual, physical, agriculture, social, economic, um, you cannot begin to address the issues of sustainable agriculture, be they smallholders or anybody else, without taking a holistic view. And that's part of the challenge that we face now, that regenerative agriculture is at a crossroads. It used to be an innovation. Until recently, it was sort of an interesting sidebar. But in the course of even just the last year, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that are going into regenerative agriculture through governments, through industry, through UN agencies, through um, philanthropies, it is suddenly infusing regenerative agriculture with a great deal of potential at the same time as some of the challenges that have not been fully addressed are coming to the fore. And this is where, um, personally, I'm very involved in that debate, a little bit loud and cranky voice. But I'm trying to balance that with being able to suggest that the Baha'i spiritual principles on agriculture, for agriculture, could be a very important counterbalance to keep this process on track. And particularly, I think that what I'm excited about is the idea that, and again, I know that this is not the right term, but essentially, Abdu'l-Baha is the patron saint of regenerative agriculture. And we need to get out there and put that, I feel, and put that out into the public domain. Because when you study, thanks to Paul's book, Adicea, it is astonishing that, I mean, as I say, I'm writing this book, so I'm going into every conceivable nuance of regenerative agriculture. It is all there in Adicea. It's just fantastic. So that's where I wanted to end my presentation and open it up to a discussion and um, your thoughts, ideas, questions. And so basically, if you can just, I hope I can see everybody. If you can just raise your hand, that little button at the bottom, and then I'll call on people if that's all right. Oh, yes. Simona.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you for your perspectives, for your research and perspectives. I find them very encouraging. And I certainly haven't done that research myself, so it's so good to know that someone is doing it. All of the comments you made about what's going on in the world, how many regenerative farmers there are, all of that is very, very encouraging. And the percentage of people who are doing that and their effects upon really the global agricultural world. So I just wanted to say thank you, and I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your book.
Thank you. By the way, one of the most prominent regenerative farmers in the United States is Al Gore, our former vice president. And his whole farm has been transitioned under his leadership to regenerative.
Where is his farm, by the way?
Tennessee, I think. I'm
Interesting.
not 100% sure.
Oh.
That's okay.
Um, any other? Oh, yes, Alberto.
Hi, I'm new in this group. I'm from Florida. I'm originally from Brazil, but we live in Florida right now. And I work on my PhD in Brazil, exactly with uh, regenerative agriculture,
Oh,
agroforestry, and some other experiment we have over there. But it's so nice. Heard some Baha'is talking about because it's a really new approach, you know. For example, in Brazil, we have those huge farms. It's all monoculture, soybean, corn,
mhm.
sugarcane, and the small farms between those. And sometimes it's really hard see those families and group, even the indigenous group progress because it's everything is directed to the big ones, the agribusiness we call that, and then even between professors and students, because the agribusiness is the main thing in Brazil. Uh, it's hard to have someone to embrace that idea. Regenerative agriculture is going to be the future, because for the society, when you see agriculture, you see money in the particular part of the world. But you see money when you see a lot of acres of land and produce commodity to export to another country. But in some sense, regenerative agriculture also bring a lot of that justice sense because you you are not only bring some economic resource to the small farm, but you kind of share a little bit of what they should have, you know. Another thing is the concept itself of regenerative agriculture. It's very nice because you um, show the idea you regenerate something, you know. The conventional agriculture, even though have some farmer has a good practice, not all farms are really concerned about regenerate the soil, regenerate the environment, and recovering ecosystems. Sometimes I have been see that a lot in Brazil. We use the land for 10, 20, 30 years, and this land is so poor after a certain period. And you start to cut pieces and leave some because it's not productive anymore, and have no concern about regenerate that part of the property or that piece of land, and in some sense, I think it's so beautiful. the whole talk and the whole idea. And I'm glad to be invited and to stay here and hear about those new
Thank
things.
you, Alberto.
Thanks, Alberto.
Alberto, can I ask you, where in Brazil? I'm interested because I've been in Brazil before. Where in Brazil are you? Where in Brazil?
So I'm
Your work?
Amazon. I'm from the Amazon
Oh, you're in
state,
Amazon. From where?
but university I'm connected, and it's in the center of Brazil,
Right.
in Mato Grosso do Sul.
Okay, I know. I've been in Goiás.
Yeah.
I used to live in Goiás.
Yeah, Goiás is in the top of yeah. I'm a little further south,
Right. Right.
in the region called Dourados.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
before I call on you, Christine, if I may just respond to Alberto. Um, in Brazil, we're working with, I serve on the board of an international organization called One Tree Planted. And we sponsor the planting of about 70 million trees a year around the world. And
Okay.
in Brazil, working with One Tree Planted, I've put together a consortium of four local partners that are all local groups. So SOS Amazonia
Hmm.
um,
In the north of
in the
Brazil.
north, and then let's see the Black Jaguar Foundation. Anyway, we're putting a project together that will help transition about 10,000 smallholder farmers over the course of 6 years to regenerative agroforestry, dealing with specifically the issues you mentioned. But
Hmm.
what's interesting is, again, just talking about this particular point in time for regenerative, the funding for that, it hasn't been finalized, but we're in discussion with it's a group of 32 of the world's largest foundations that have come together to collectively set aside money for the transitioning of smallholder farmers to regenerative agriculture. And that includes the Rockefeller Foundation, some of you know Roy Steiner. Um, and so we're working with that network of foundations for this particular project, which will be in the Amazon basin in three of the provinces. But and I'm going to come back to one other thing you mentioned, Alberto, with regard to um, the industrial agriculture's impact on things like soil. Because I'm going to put Archie on the spot in a minute, because I don't want to totally dump on industrial agriculture. That's where I grew up, you know. And so we have to be fair about the progress that's been made there. But before that, if I could call on Christine, please.
Thank you. And well, mainly I want to thank you so much for your knowledge, your thoughts, and your actions, which are so valuable for us and for the world. And I look so much forward to your book. I have a question. Um, you said that if half of the smallholder farmers of the world, about 12 million farmers, if they switch to regenerative agriculture, they could feed an additional 1.5 billion people. This is so amazing. And I am really curious to know what are the practical measures
Mhm.
that would increase the production. I know that it's much more healthy for the environment, it's more socially just and everything. But what I don't understand is what are the practical implications? Why do they produce more food than other systems, like just organic or whatever?
Well, like any other um, part of the human story, agriculture must continually evolve. It never stays static. And smallholder farmers have been systematically marginalized and ignored since the early 1960s. So they have not been able to collectively evolve. And so they're stuck in a kind of retro world where productivity is very low. So even stepping forward to provide the most basic forms of support in terms of high quality seed and training and setting up seed banks so that you have a local recurring source of seeds and I say tools, other basic services which large-scale industrial farms take for granted. That's the agricultural extension services in Canada, the United States, throughout Europe, um, all of the research and support systems that are behind industrial agriculture that is virtually non-existent for smallholders. So if you even start with the basics, not even regenerative, not even organic, just give them a little bit of support. What's astonishing is what changes. And this I discovered myself in Haiti. The farmers that we were working with, and we began by introducing organic, we're now moving to regenerative, um, their productivity increased by an average of 40%, just based on additional support to do their own work. We weren't, our basic model in Haiti is that I wanted to plant trees, part of my sense of obligation to my mentor, Richard St. Bar Baker, go out and plant some trees. So in Haiti, the only people available to plant trees, this is the honest truth, the only people available to plant trees were smallholders. So my colleague and I had to figure out what would be the reason for them wanting to plant trees. So we said, we'll give you agricultural support. Again, I didn't start out thinking that that was a good thing. It was just, how do you get them to plant trees? And so providing that basic support, we were shocked at the impact. So they planted trees to earn the credits that they could turn in for seed, tools, training, and other things. And then suddenly they were increasing their productivity, and then that resulted in, sometimes 100% increase in farm household income. So on top of that, when you introduce regenerative, then you really have the potential for significant increases. And the number, by the way, if you take, this is just my own projection, if you take half of the 475 million smallholder farmers in the world, so that would be 475, that would be whatever that number is, 240 million, knowing that the group of those, the whole total of smallholders already produce 30% of the world's food. Anyway, so out of that comes, hopefully a realistic projection of the impact that they could have if we had the transition to regenerative. Rose is next, I think.
Thank you. I'm so glad I came to this talk, and I really appreciate. I love that you are soon to publish principles that will are inspired by the Baha'i teachings that will guide a growth of regenerative agriculture, smart agriculture in the future. And I something you said when you were talking about when you were comparing agroecology and regenerative agriculture caught my attention because of my experience in Colombia. You had said that possibly that agroecology was more politicized versus regenerative agriculture. Okay. And so what I experienced in Colombia was actually the opposite. In conversations with farmers, it seemed like and maybe because agroecology, the concept, I believe, maybe originated in Colombia. You probably correct me on that, but I know that there's some like champions of that methodology in Colombia. And there was actually a Baha'i farmer that practiced that in outside of Bogota. But yeah, so from my understanding and conversations, and I was taking this class in the time, so I talked to people about it, was that it was regenerative agriculture was seen as sort of this corporate driven concept, at least in the beginning. And then I think it has since transformed. It's like perception in the public, but it was seen as more sort of respecting that ancestral knowledge. Agroecology was seen as like the first kind of approach to agriculture that was like looking at the whole community. So I was just wondering what your,
Well,
if you had conversation, it seems like you have a lot of experience in the global South. So yeah, what do you have any thoughts on that, like how it's perceived?
you're touching on sort of part of the complexity of all of this. I mean,
Yeah.
in Colombia, you've got Fundiak, which is the Baha'i inspired institution, which is, I mean, if we're talking about champions in agriculture, I mean, that is it. I mean, that is the application of Baha'i principles at a level that is just simply breathtaking, you know? And I'm in close touch with Bitte and Gustavo, and I mean, they're doing extraordinary work. But they were able to engage in agroecology because it's more, even if you're following regenerative agriculture in much of Latin America, people will just assume automatically that it's agroecology because that's, especially in a place like Brazil, um, they don't really even identify particularly regenerative at this point. It's sort of a default agroecology. But when you look at the origin of agroecology, and it evolved simultaneously in several countries, but it was shaped primarily by the experience in Brazil, where it was seen as a people's movement, as a peasant movement. We don't use that word now, but I mean, it was part of how it was framed. And with that came a lot of the um, political ideals at the time of the emergence of agroecology. So I wouldn't say that it's the same everywhere by any means, but it certainly is part of the legacy, and I don't think you can escape that. But to your, as you've mentioned, regenerative is becoming more known now, and I think it's gaining a better name. But again, to some of the points I raised earlier, I think it's important to acknowledge the validity of all of these different sustainability initiatives. They are part of the same extended family, you know.
Mhm.
It's, it's the progressive revelation of sustainable agriculture. I know I shouldn't be quoted on that. Um,
Thank you.
who's next in this list? I'm losing track here.
Even figures, maybe.
Stephen, fire away.
Hi, Hugh. This is a question of such stunning naivety that probably you will laugh it out of court. But um, is it true to say that the only way we could have relatively high productivity agriculture of this sort on with very small holdings is to have benevolent co-ops at both ends? I'm thinking that um, from what I read from Adesir, the Abdu'l Baha recommended very, very large amounts of manure, for instance. Now, it's extremely unlikely that smallholders are going to be able to have um, a, a herd of anything of sufficient numbers to produce any kind of biological diversity. So, what do you do? Do you something like the old Iowa tradition of pigging the fields, inviting other people to come and have their animals onto your land, or do you have a co-op that buys manure and brings it in? When you're dealing with relatively small surpluses which cannot be sold locally, I've seen this done in Pakistan where milk is bought in relatively small quantities by a co-op. People, women largely send a text to the milk company and put a churn out, and the milk company comes around. But it seems to me that you probably need a benign co-op, both for inputs and outputs, or am I missing something?
Well, I mean, you raise a very valid point. The challenge is looking at compost as the beneficiary of contemporary science, but being implemented on smallholder farms. So if you look at some of the research that's been done in Brazil, for example, by the Agricultural Extension Service there, and they have entire categories dealing with green manure and what's the optimum temperature for a large compost pile that doesn't have manure but is designed working only with plant matter, and what's the ideal depth? What should be the size of the hole at the top in order to aerate to have maximum impact? I mean, you'd be astonished at the level of detail I've seen in some of the research. But making that research available, that's my AI project for research. But I digress. But it just is, as soon as you elevate smallholder farming to be the recipient of support and research and innovation, and make it so that those things happen at a local level and are driven by the smallholder farmers themselves, and they begin to be the agents to transfer that knowledge within communities. Um, then you have, I, I know I'm talking a lot about my book. I'm very fascinated with the role of fractal geometry as a way to identify the process of change within large-scale dispersed communities. And if you think of farm cooperatives as fractal agents to be able to um, share knowledge, then it's not a linear replication, it's this nodal fractals. But I digress. Sorry. Farzaneh, hello.
Hi, lovely to see you here after so long. Hugh John, I was wondering if there is any material that we could include for junior youth for education. If you have any and you could share it with Dawn, she could share it with me, or you can email it to me, because we are trying to educate our junior youth and children with this new way of thinking and finding new solution. So
Mm.
if you have any material, please share it with us.
I will do that, and I'll send that to Dawn for sure. Philip.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to say, right now I'm in Mexico, so I apologize for the noise. I'm here to visit some farmers that I got connected with actually through the Association for Baha'i Studies. These farmers are actually Baha'is. They're indigenous. They are engaged in regenerative agriculture. And actually the purpose of my trip is just to basically consult with them and see how I might be able to support them. So, some really excellent ideas that I've taken away from this meeting, including education. I'd love to be connected with to connect with some educational resources that I can potentially share with them. And also, I'm going in with an open mind, a consultative attitude to see how I can possibly be supportive, and also just kind of move into the mainstream of agricultural commerce. Obviously, I'm talking about a kind of slightly new mainstream, but I'm trying to think beyond, subsidies and into getting the products. For example, these farmers are coffee farmers, right? So potentially getting these products into the hands of wider range of consumers, possibly at a slightly elevated price point, right? We know that, quote unquote, fair trade prices are often below the price of production, et cetera. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of set forth my situation briefly and see if, there's any tips that could be shared with me. And if anybody wants to connect with me, you can, search my name on LinkedIn and whatever, and we can discuss further. Thank you.
Well, Philip, one of the things that it took me a while, frankly, to get to this point, because, when you start off as an NGO, you're always kind of, just giving stuff out. And then it comes to a point when you realize that if you're working with, for example, smallholder farmers, and you're always giving stuff out and being supportive, that can be good. But what happens when you leave? And so I have, not of my own volition, come to appreciate that unless you can begin to build market access for smallholder farmers from day one, you are basically setting yourself up for failure and not doing a service to the farmers you're working with. So focusing, for example, on coffee is a great example. And so when we start working with a group of farmers, we basically we're introducing regenerative principles at the same time as we're saying, what is your existing market access, both local, regional, and export? And you have to be careful. You don't want everything to hinge on a single export because markets are volatile. But at the same time, building those connections so that, for example, one of the great things about regenerative agriculture is you need to have a mix of crops, avoiding monoculture. And so as soon as you have a mix, then you're starting to introduce more local varieties into a farming situation, which means you've got potential for new secondary markets. And so if you can carefully, work with the farmers to help identify what has been grown in the region. Let's say it's in the case of Haiti, something called pigeon peas, and they've been widely used in the past, grown. But when you introduce them to smallholder farmers who haven't grown them before, suddenly they've got a very viable market based on a locally sourced seed, so it's not an import. And they just hadn't really thought of it before because they didn't think that they could get access to that market. So you help to make that connection, and then you're both reinforcing the diversity on the farm as well as helping to set up some additional income. So good luck on the project, Philip.
Thanks, Hugh. I appreciate those comments.
Arthur.
Wonderful presentation, and it raises a series of questions. First, scaling up to millions of people is not the easiest thing. Funding Act tried for years and is going to a certain scale of building, human capacities and creating people to take the lead in their own communities. But is there something in the institute process that we've been given by the House of Justice that is designed to be able to scale up to people turning to the faith at some very rapid time in the future? Maybe there's some model there to look at going forward in terms of the kinds of materials to be made available and how people might be trained in their use and so on and so forth, so that this could scale up around the world more rapidly. I think you talk about the issue of market access. We need to sort of rethink the whole supply chain process so it becomes a more organic, bottom-up process rather than something driven by the local market, the global markets. And so I think there's some thinking there in terms of rethinking the supply chains above the individual small-scale farmers that they can connect to. Also, very often one finds that farming by itself doesn't provide all the income that is needed. And so you need to combine it with some kind of small scale crafts or activities that can create a supplemental source of income for the local farmers. It may be that there's an off season when they're not working so much, and they can produce something with a craft or something of that sort that then gives them another source of income beyond the farming itself. And then we also have the example of Abdu'l Baha when he talked about the local storehouse. He says
Yes.
when somebody doesn't have enough income to cover their expenses, they receive that from the storehouse. And clearly, with climate change and variability and rainfall and so on, farmers have good years and bad years. So there needs to be kind of a social mechanism at the local level where somebody has not succeeded, for one reason or another, that they receive what they need to keep producing, the following years. So I think there are a number of elements from the Baha'i approach that can help to fill out what you're trying to do, which is going to be very exciting going forward. Thank you.
Well, as you're more aware than most, Arthur, I felt that in the book I needed to address the issue of scaling in a way that is addressing non-Baha'i institutions. So I'm looking at several different models. Number one, biological corridors. It's an existing international framework. And if it was possible to identify the equivalent of a biological corridor, where you would have large-scale landscape-level intervention to support smallholder transitioning. And by the way, we identify 3 years as being the minimum necessary period of subsidized transition, because you can't just start and suddenly pop up as regenerative. It takes some work. Anyway, but the idea of the biological corridor, which is transnational, but does not require the participating countries to give up any autonomy or control necessarily, but it is an established mechanism for that kind of collaboration. So that's one. Secondly, I go in detail to look at the forestry models. So the Great Green Wall in both Northern Africa and China. And I know it has, there's issues. It's not like it's ready for, adoption, but at least it does have a transnational component on the African side. And then there's AF 100 and the other examples like that. So I'm trying to map out existing models that could be used to take on a large scale collaborative intervention with smallholders that would represent essentially a test case for humanity to be able to pull this off, in a way that uses existing potential political frameworks in advance of having something more comprehensive, as you alluded to, with regard to the storeholding, the the storing of grain example from Abdu'l-Baha, which represents an ideal, which I'm not sure we're necessarily going to be able to see implemented in the near future. So again, the book goes into a lot of detail in how that could work and use existing mechanisms so it wouldn't be quite so threatening or scary for non-Baha'is to consider.
Thank you.
Also, I just wanted to mention, oh, no, I think I've covered it. Thanks. Jay.
Yeah, thank you. I was interested what you said about the providing agricultural support for the planters, the small farmers that were planting trees,
Hmm.
and how their productivity increased. And you hope that the small farmer would be recipients of support, and that they could become change agents. So, what about the idea of Baha'i clusters getting that support and and building learning communities
Hmm.
where an individual initiative would have the support and they wouldn't fail. It'd be easier and they'd be more successful, and they could collaborate with the whole cluster instead of doing it by themselves. And again, when they have a problem, they can have technical support so that there won't be failures. And you're interested in the fractal approach. And so I can imagine the clusters being intelligent and agro productive, collaborating with other clusters and forming regional networks. And then they could work together, whether, for instance, if growing peanuts, making peanut butter, manufacturing on top of the agriculture, but and so that we would have a fractal network of clusters performing social and economic development, with agriculture being the foundation. And again, having the learning communities, that they would have the technical support so that everybody would be successful. That's and you the and you were talking about a global network that you were hoping to see, and I think that that a fractal global network of Baha'i communities
Hmm.
might be the solution.
Well, how to frame this nicely?
Uh-oh.
No, because personally, even though I understand that there is an absolute role for Baha'i communities to be engaged in this, I'm not interested in Baha'is. I'm interested in non-Baha'is embracing Baha'i principles and putting them into action. And I don't care if they become Baha'is. Isn't that, I'm sorry. Um, and I say this respectfully because, I mean, at one level, we are not going to be involved in the lesser peace. And I want to get to the lesser peace as fast as possible. And if I can do something that contributes toward that process, and it has to involve non-Baha'is, because we're not going to be part of the lesser peace. And so I want to figure out how do you engage large numbers of non-Baha'is taking Baha'i principles and putting them into action. And they don't have to be a Baha'i to do that. And we've been a little hesitant as Baha'is in sharing these ideas in the past. And I think that we have to, this is me speaking, I have to get over that and say, listen, you don't have to buy the whole package. However, we have some very specific things that you can take and put into action and be successful at. And here they are. Take it or leave it, you know? So what I'm trying to balance is that enough engagement in the very specific professional minutia of regenerative agriculture so that I at least can fake my way to seeing so that I know what I'm talking about. But at the same time, it's saying, and over here are these Baha'i ideas that fit seamlessly into that process, you know? If I may, I want to go back to Archie for a second, and I'm not going to ask you to talk, Archie, unless you want to, but I do feel obligated to acknowledge that even though I set industrial agriculture up as the bad guy, and it is a source of much of the ills in terms of climate change, but um, such progress has been made in industrial agriculture, and it's not going to go away. So we need to just say, okay, how can you improve that? And Archie's been helping me to better understand the developments with regard to micro application of fertilizer and seed and everything else, based on cloud technology and all of that. And I really want to acknowledge that that's been a process that has been going on and should be acknowledged as such. And yes, I think that calling a large scale monoculture farm regenerative and the one that uses GMOs is absolutely at the same time, we have to acknowledge the progress that's being made in other sectors. Do you want to comment, Archie?
I don't I don't know where to start exactly, but the way you introduced me, it would be as though I'm an apologist for large scale, highly technical farming. And although my neighbors are really involved with that, that's not quite where I am. Um, my own personal view is that nothing we've discussed in the world around us is going to solve all our problems. Um, whether it's a really small scale local farmer or the large farms, they've both got certain kinds of problems that happen with them. Um, Overall, my main concerns aren't with the technology of farming. That's something science can deal with. What we have our biggest problems, I would think, with are and I first scrolled down, it said social and political structures, but maybe I should maybe say social and policy structures for defining our problems and for coming to solutions. Um, and we've even heard a little bit of that today. I mean, what's the difference between organic or regenerative or different kinds of things? We've got little things going on, and those are sort of in the policy and social things. Um, I Do you mind if I just sort of bring up some questions on things that I've heard rather than say anything in particular? Just to leave people.
Go for it.
Well, um, I'm concerned about our ecological footprint that we're using right now. Um, and just planting trees or other kinds of carbon sequestration don't solve some of that stuff. My understanding, and I only heard this recently, that a large part of our fossil fuels, yes, they're very old, but they also came about at a very specific geological time when woody plants developed out of the soft tissue plants. And there was a few 100,000 years where there were no fungi or other organisms that effectively broke down and digested the woody fibers, the lignins and that kind of stuff. So that was when a large part of our accumulation happened. So we're right now we're farming and transporting and doing all kinds of things on fossil fuels which cannot be replaced. There's no possible way to get those things back in the ground that they were. So whether you use carbon capture, sure, you can put carbon in a form underground in storage tanks. What happens if that leaks suddenly? You'll have a catastrophic failure. There are physical limits to what soil will hold. So you can't get 100. You need certain combinations of things in soils to make them work effectively. Stephen talked about economies of scale.
Oh, if I may, let me respond to that one. Again, just going back to the idea that there's going to be 1.5 billion more people by 2050,
Yeah.
all in the global south. And so just in terms of fuel alone, growing all the additional food, or more or less all the additional food locally, immediately has a footprint impact in terms of climate and fuel's contribution to that. And so I think that there's a lot of dimensions to this, but I mean, just right off the bat, that would seem to me to be a logical one, you know?
I'm not going to argue with that. That sounds perfectly reasonable. But that comes down to part of what I talk about having the political and social structures
Hello.
to just define our problems and come up with our solutions.
Yep.
And that was Arthur Dahl brought up the institute process, and I think that's an integral part of that. It's part of our learning, our training, and developing people to make good decisions. And maybe I should stop with that because I don't see our problems being as much with the technology as with our policy or sociological society issues, which is what the revelation is supposed to be able to deal with, bring about a transformation of individuals and of our civilizations.
Absolutely.
So
thank you, Archie. We went to school together. We were rebels in high school. Could I call on Helga next because or sorry, am I in the right order here?
No, that's right. Well, Alberto has spoken already, if that's
all right, Alberto. So Helga?
Yeah, just a short question. I was wondering how their efforts here in Pennsylvania and also we have some family in Vermont to establish more regional food systems. So smaller farms can distribute their foods at a nearby regional level. And it seems from what I gleaned, my daughter-in-law works for a nonprofit that helps small farmers to connect to markets and offers like storage facilities, cold storage, etc. The farmers themselves, I guess, is still a wide variety of what the practices are. Some more conventional, others along the lines of permaculture, organic, what have you. Now, do you see these regional food webs growing in the US in various states? And do you feel that they become a vehicle for regenerative agriculture?
Well, there's a growing movement right now of regenerative farmers and researchers in the United States in particular starting to form alliances. And they're trying to figure out how they can share market access, how they can share innovations, how they can share information about, financing sources and things like that. So if you look at groups like, if you look up MAD agriculture, literally MAD, then the word agriculture, you'll see some very interesting work being done to help in these kind of connections. So I think it's growing, but I mean, it's a difficult time right now for farmers in the United States. But absolutely no question about that. Well, not just in the United States, but in particular right now. But at the same time, there's this counterpoint of, I think, an emerging community that's starting to look at these things, which I think is encouraging. Paula?
Yeah.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, Hugh, for this wonderful presentation. I'm so sorry I just missed you in Haiti.
Oh,
I was there 5 years and I left in 2000.
okay.
And I was in Artibonite, not where the rice is grown. I was in the Gonaïve and worked in the Northwest.
Oh, I know Gonaïve so well.
You know Gonaïve so well. Okay.
What's it? What's that lovely um, Hotel des Arbres? What was the
Gonaïve.
proprietor's name? Anyway, you
Okay.
probably stayed there.
I wish I would have met you while I was there. But I have two questions. Well, I'm a nutritionist, so without the farmer and food, there's no nutritionist. Okay, but I was also responsible partially for distributing food through Public Law 480 in the Northwest, and that was an absolute horror. Yeah. Okay. No, I personally I wanted to know, has regenerative agriculture extended into the Artibonite?
Yes, we have three different locations where we're doing a pilot project that currently involves about 900 farm families. And we're in the starting the second year of intensive training. Um, and so it's a challenging time in Haiti. But the gangs that you hear about in the news really are not interested in agriculture. They do not have a staff of agronomists. And so our farmers are proceeding as well as they can in the rural areas. They have challenges about, inflation and getting fuel and access to markets, but they're largely, able to continue. And so we have a very robust program there's always the challenge of fundraising. Um, but we're holding our own at the moment.
Okay. And my particular question is, I have worked in very isolated areas, and to do nutrition where there is no food and being dependent on like imported foods from the United States to remote Pacific islands.
Mm.
My guiding principle always was God has provided for every place. We just have to find out what it is that grows there.
Exactly.
Okay. And so, yeah. But what I'm still wondering about also, because you gave those examples about the South and all those small holding farmers and the food needs for the world by 2050. What about these words from Abdul Baha that we should not ship food long distance? It always boggled me because, yeah.
Well,
Do you have any thoughts on that?
it gets to the core issue of food sovereignty. People rightly have focused a lot on food security, meaning that when there's a famine somewhere, you should ship food to them. Okay, well, I get that. But if you have the capacity to grow the food locally and you don't need to have imports, then that is what defines food sovereignty. You are responsible and capable for feeding your own population. If you look at Haiti, for example, and rice, this is one of the single best examples in the world of what the issue is. Up until the early 90s, Haiti produced almost all the rice that it needed. Then along came, the fall of the Papa Doc regime, and there were a lot of reasons. Bill Clinton has apologized for his role in this. But Haiti reduced the tariff on rice to less than 3% of imported rice. And that meant that subsidized American rice cost less on the streets and markets in rural Haiti than locally grown rice. So today, going from almost 100% self-sufficiency in rice, Haiti, and this is not an exaggeration, and I looked it up recently with the USDA website just to make sure I wasn't making stuff up. Haiti is the fourth largest importer of American rice in the world. I mean, how does that make any sense? Um, so we have to address things like that, that where there's just no need to set up these international systems that encourage the shipping unnecessarily of food around the world. You look at what happened during the food crisis in what was it, 2008? Anyway, you look at all these different scenarios when we've had a problem with um, shipping of grain and other things, and it's caused huge local problems, not least of which the fact that it upsets international markets. So to your point, Paula, I think that we have to recognize that food sovereignty should be one of the cornerstones of regenerative agricultural approach. I'm not even going to try and say your name. Can you?
Yeah, you're very wise. It's genius.
Genius. Well, that's not so bad.
No, if you think of Dr. Zhivago, remember Dr. Zhivago, ZH, Zha, and I think that's how the Guardian used ZH for Zha. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. In the last question that was just raised, beside this sovereignty and cost issues and all that, I think two other things is like the carbon footprint, I think is something very quite big, and also the healthy, like how healthier food is when it's grown locally and matured on trees, shrubs, whatever, and then brought, right? So such a wisdom that Abdul Baha has used, and I'm very surprised to hear that Abdul Baha addressed it. I just knew, this parts of it. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, also, if I may just to say, in the example of rice in Haiti, one of the things that happened when imported rice started to flood the market is that the eating habits changed. And it represented a huge increase in consumption of white rice, which is not necessarily the best way to structure your nutritional daily intake, And so I think that that's another dimension of it. But sorry, back to you.
No, that was great. Yes, you're right. I really was interested in what you mentioned. Among all the other things that you mentioned that were great, that you're looking at this as the progressive revelation kind of a thing, because it's sort of as allowing for other practices that have existed and are still existing to not feel that they were some sort of there was some sort of flaw or terrible thing about it, but allow for a place for them to all come and consult, right? Talk to each other and grow from then on. And I really appreciated hearing that. And I think it would work really well when other people hear that there wasn't anything wrong with that practice, perhaps, but we could do better.
And more on that is to acknowledge that each one of them has something very specific to be able to contribute. You look at the work of biointensive, and this is my old friend John Jevons in Southern California, and he's a leader in this particular area, and it's highly intensive multi-crops next to each other on small plots of land using no-till and other things, and they have amazing results, but it's very labor intensive, so it doesn't necessarily translate to large scale application, but we can still learn things from that. John's book. The worst title I've ever heard, but it turned out to be a bestseller. It was called How to Grow More Vegetables on Less Land Than You Ever Thought Possible. It's like a whole paragraph as a book title. But it had it's very popular within that particular category of people, of farmers.
And it's, very applicable, right? Like our cities are getting bigger, the lands are becoming, it's fabulous that we have these farmlands that we could, learn how to, plant various kind of plants and, all these that you had mentioned. But we have smaller cities too that, that little plots could be used. I was at a Christmas party last night at a friend of mine's house, who she's interested in the faith. Anyways, she has a little small land that she does organic farming, and she does beautiful job at it. And a friend that I met there, she was talking about how, she's using whatever that she is gathering from different places and bringing to homeless people. So like when we have this sort of like small farmers practices in cities or, bigger places, we could address that also as along the way, right? The homeless situation, that we could provide jobs, we could provide food, all these practical things. It's got so much practical sides to it, which is so beautiful. I'm so glad you're doing it, and I'm really thankful for being here. And I wanted to thank my friend Janet for inviting me for this talk.
Well,
and welcome for the future ones.
That very specific point, I think that one of the things that excites me is seeing the way in which introduction of something like regenerative agriculture with smallholders starts to change the community itself. Our experience in Haiti, we set up we have 11 different branch locations and 33 tree nurseries. And that's where all the farmers go to do their volunteer time to grow the trees, transplant them, yada, yada. But those nurseries are also where the training takes place. It's where the seed distribution happens. It's where the seed banks are based. And so, not by design, I hasten to add, what ended up happening is that those little tree nurseries, because they were non-political, they were part of helping the community to thrive, they became de facto local community leadership centers. And farmers began to come with their disputes, asking our farm leaders to help adjudicate things because they trusted them more than they trusted the local politicians, which is probably quite smart. Now, the only problem was that local politicians started to show up. So we had to pass a rule that no politician could become a member of the Smallholder Farmers Alliance. Then only one example, and I'll stop. So there was this politician who didn't get the message. He turned up one day wearing honest to God, it was like a silver lame suit in the middle of the heat of Haiti. And he came in and he was just all, oh, you guys, I've got all sorts of things I'm going to do for you, And basically they chased him out. I said, it's all right, just don't hit him on the way out. We should probably limit this. Dawn, I don't want to go over time, but thanks.
Yeah.
Alberto and then Brian, if that's all right, to wrap up.
And then we'll finish. Thank you.
Sorry, I talk too much, but I have 2 points to raise over here. One is regenerative agriculture contribute to local markets, for example. And of course, in my mind, the sovereignty is already included because if I look, for example, in Brazil, when we don't have small farmers, we don't have regenerative agriculture. And then we stop to produce, for example, for local markets, mango, I don't know, beans, something we eat on a regular basis, because those big farms, they produce to export, not for the local markets.
Yeah.
No, this is one point. Another point is I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. I have been in Costa Rica last year as a part of my study. I went to learn a little more about um, environment service, and they have a really interesting experience. For about 30 years, they actually compensate small farms who plant trees, and now they start to compensate whoever work with agroforestry as well, you
Mhm.
know. But of course, this it's something in some place work, some place they need to change a little bit to be suitable. For example, in Costa Rica, they changed the laws. And the beginning of the 90 they changed the forest laws, for example. They only have a 27% of the coverage, the original coverage. They didn't have much forest. Since then, they changed the law. They reinforced many policy. Now they have almost six of the coverage again. But the very interesting thing is, even though it's not sustainable, they use part of the tax from the fuel to compensate those farmers who protect areas where have water, biodiversity, and plant trees to have carbon sequestration, carbon stock, you know. And another thing they pay in Costa Rica for farmers is about to recover areas to have in order to have beauty, scenic beauty, because it's very important, especially for ecotourism. Costa Rica is well known by the ecotourism happening there.
Yeah.
All those things come together because I think it's a big national effort to make the country looks better and international scenery, and also have some kind of economic compensation for the small farmers because they usually don't have much to do or don't have much to uh, buy food, you know.
Right.
But it can be can happen in different ways in different places. Costa Rica use the natural resource, but in other places they can regenerate areas and at the same time create the possibility to have more environment service, and then people can pay for that. For example,
But to your point, Alberto, if I may, the need to make sure that these things get implemented sensibly. So, for example, in Brazil, there is a national law that's been in place for some time that mandates that when schools throughout the country purchase from local smallholder farmers, that they're required to pay a premium price for organic produce for school meals. However, almost no farmers are able to take advantage of that because in order to qualify for
they
the
have to be
premium, they have to pay for third-party certification and they can't afford it. So it's a net zero. I mean, it was with the best of intentions, but you always have to look at these things and make sure that they can stay on track. I'm going to call, if I may, on Brian, because I know if you don't mind, Alberto, we're coming up to the end of the time, if that's all right.
okay. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for raising those points. Brian.
My comments also about Costa Rica. I've spent between after starting in 2007, about a decade in the indigenous Talamanca Preserve in the southeast corner of Costa Rica. It was a beautiful piece of rainforest rising up into the foothills of the Talamanca mountain range until Dole came in and ripped out the rainforest and planted bananas. And they harvested bananas for a few years until the virus hit,
and then they walked away from it. And then the government, out of the goodness of their heart, decided to make that an indigenous preserve for the indigenous population of Bribri and Kabakar in the region. When I got there in 2007, it was a well overgrown second growth, obviously not of rainforest trees, but of banana trees and other smaller indigenous plants. And the uh, indigenous population were farmers by default. And they each had a little piece of land apportioned to them, and um, on which they could harvest the bananas that were still growing once again, um, and doing very little else. A bit of chocolate cacao growing, but mostly as the bananas. And the thing that changed was the introduction of the PAS program through the Baha'i community and the indigenous population. And right now, that looks to me like, I mean, I really loved it, as somebody who I've always described myself as a terrible student but an excellent learner. That the PS program has taken that grade 7 to 10 curriculum and sliced the disciplines in the other direction. And it is their on the ground experience that drives the necessity to learn to read, to learn to do arithmetic and math, to acquire information about the sciences, in order to do the things that they naturally want to do. And there's no, reading, writing, arithmetic, whatever it is all jumbled up as a response out of necessity that is driven by their own internal motivation to have something to eat. So that works for me. And it was really impressive to see back then the beginnings of that. But as I keep monitoring, because I was down there for a month or a month and a half every year for a decade working with them in that, and we ended up installing micro solar systems to provide light and cell phone powering. That was done on a kind of a microfinance model. And that was my contribution to the project of tutorial learning that PAS is. But watching them now, I see these young people out there with experimental plots and doing shade grown stuff and actually starting to regenerate some of the original rainforest growth. And it's really interesting and exciting to see. I don't have a connection really that works for me down there to get a lot of information about it. I'd really like any references any of you can give me for more of what's happening there currently, but um, I always wanted to go to Haiti and do something similar and to help with that. And I didn't know that you were there at the time. And I've just come back from Jamaica where, and we're back to this whole thing about, um, the same way that I've always understood poverty as a policy, agricultural policy creates the limitations and the successes as well every now and then. Um, the policy in Jamaica has not really been to recognize smallholder farmers as anything other than um, under underpaid and underfed citizens who are in a rural area. Um, and
to the point you raised earlier, Brian, one of the things that I'm, again, sorry to plug my book, but I'm doing profiles of smallholder regenerative programs from around the world. Because what I've discovered is that there's so many innovations that we don't know about, and that people in the space of regenerative agriculture don't know about, but they're having all these pockets of success. And so I'm profiling about I don't know, 15 of them. None of them, well, only Fundiak is Baha'i related. All the rest are have nothing connected with Baha'i. But projects in India and Honduras and all over the place. And it's been fascinating just reaching out to these people and finding out what they're doing and then being able to tell their story for them. I think on that we might need to wrap because we've zipped past the.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. It's all up to you, Hugh. We did have Emmanuel wanted to know if he could ask a question.
Oh,
If it
yeah,
be
sorry.
a question, Emmanuel?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I've not been able to follow up conveniently. Actually, I have been an agronomist who has worked for so many years in Africa. And the type of agriculture we do there, we generally consider it as small farmer agriculture, depending on the scale, particularly. In fact, you talk here of 2 to 4 hectares, but you hardly find somebody within that range, or find people between that kind, 0 point, between 0.5 and maybe 1, 2 hectares, especially when it comes to production of cocoa. Yeah. So I have done that, and we have had in Africa, in Cameroon in particular, so many models of agriculture which we have had to use. Okay. Now, when you talked of Abdul Baha, and my mind went to a model which is more or less a Baha'i model. I don't know what it is, but again, I find you trying to maybe distance yourself from the Baha'i. I don't know. You said some statements which I was doubting, and then I was trying to find out. Pardon?
Perhaps you were thinking of when he said he was trying to appeal not to Baha'is but to others. Is that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, you are right.
And the
Yes.
reason for that.
And
yeah.
Well,
Yes.
and Emmanuel, I know I'm just interested in being able to reach people who they may decide that they want to become a Baha'i, but my real interest is in explaining to them what the Baha'i principles are that they can apply, and
Okay.
and being clear that they don't need to sign a card to use the
I
Baha'i
see.
principles at a community level. That's
Okay.
just to clarify.
Okay. So you are staying in Haiti. Were you a Baha'i pioneer or?
No, I live in Westchester, New York. And I've always gone back and forth to Haiti. I can't go there at the moment for security reasons, but I still remain directly involved.
Okay.
Just for WhatsApp.
Yes. And I know in Cameroon, in particular, when we are making a choice of an agricultural model, we take into consideration how it will affect poverty. And maybe some marginalized groups of people like women, the youths. Okay. But then,
Just to that point, Emmanuel, interestingly enough, I just heard yesterday from a very dear and old friend of mine in Cameroon. She's not a Baha'i, but her name is Ruth Engo. I don't know if you ever heard of her. She works with primarily young girls and women and young girls, helping them to address hygiene issues and particularly establishing toilets, believe it or not, in schools so that girls understand the need for that and personal hygiene and things. Anyway, she's one of my heroes, Ruth.
Okay, okay, interesting. Yeah, so I remember somebody was trying to find out whether someone could have some additional source of income in order to permit him or her to be sustained on small farmer or regenerative agriculture.
Well, to that
Uh,
point, a lot of the emphasis when you're trying to work with groups of smallholders, you want to be able to both connect them to markets for what they're growing, but then also provide, for example, small loans or grants to be able to establish micro businesses that, especially ones that are run by cooperatives, so that they've
yeah.
got a good stronghold in the community. Things like, initial processing to make peanut butter or jam or harvest honey from forests and things like that. So we've done a lot of that in Haiti, and it's always been incredibly successful. And we encourage that, and in fact, we include in our budgets in working with smallholders in these various countries that I mentioned that we're doing through my nonprofit. We have a special allocation for micro enterprise to be able to be sure that we encourage that within.
Okay. Yeah, and I was trying also to look at the adoption rate of regenerative agriculture in the poor countries. And I'm imagining that definitely is going to be low. So I don't know what is your experience.
Well, right now, the majority of the majority of regenerative farms are already in the global south. But it's not happening at a level that you would see in the news. We tend to get bad news as the priority. But I'll give you one example. I was speaking recently to representatives of the Aga Khan Foundation, the Ismaili Muslim, who are very friendly to us and happily. I was surprised to learn that the Aga Khan Foundation is directly supporting the transition of 3.6 million smallholder farmers in Africa. Like, um, and I said to them, I said, I pride myself on being reasonably well informed about who's doing what. I said, to be honest, I never heard that you were doing this. They said, well, we didn't think we should tell anybody till recently.
Okay.
And it was only in the last couple of months that they've begun to think about sharing that information. Because I said, you've got best practice learning that people would be grateful to receive. So there's more going on in the developing countries than you might think, Manuel.
All right. So I don't know if okay. Anyway, I don't know if I can have your address or phone number, and then I can take some other questions on. Let
Certainly,
me
if
see.
you ask Dawn, she'll share my email.
Okay. I'll talk to her. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, are we wrapping? Dawn,
Yes,
I don't know
I think we're finished. Emmanuel, are you
Okay.
if you would put your email address in there, I can send you.
Okay. Let me see. Okay.
Donna, I can send it just in the interest of saving time.
Pardon me?
I can send it. I've known Emmanuel since 1984.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Okay.
Janet,
Right.
yes.
I don't have your.
And
I'm
it's
sorry, I
Janet.
don't.
Yeah,
Janet has your
it's
email.
Janet who introduced me to this. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Janet will send it to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. I'll be in
All
touch.
right.
All right. So much.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Hugh. Really, very interesting and very involved discussion, much interest in this topic. So thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share, because getting the feedback from you was, for me, a really important part of the process of continuing to address this issue. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.